She looked too plain to belong in seat 1A. A 12-year-old girl, hair neatly tied, hands folded in her lap, wearing no luxury, just presence. When the flight attendant asked her to leave, she didn't protest. When the man laughed and tossed water on her dress, she only whispered, "Thank you." But behind those calm eyes, something was brewing. 5 minutes later, the lights flickered. An executive boarded mid-flight, and by the time they landed, the airline had lost more than money. They lost silence. Because that little girl didn't shout. She didn't fight. She just pressed one button, and the sky cracked open. The boarding gate buzzed with final calls as passengers filtered into Flight 719 bound for Washington, D.C. Among the flow of suits, strollers, and rolling luggage, a small figure walked in silence. 12-year-old Grace Hill stepped onto the plane wearing a pale gray cardigan over a simple white dress. Her shoes were scuffed, her hair neatly pulled back with a clip. No backpack, just a small brown purse slung crossbody and a folded paper in her hand, her boarding pass. She moved with a quiet confidence, eyes scanning the seat numbers like she'd done this many times before. She stopped at 1A, first row, window seat in first class. Without hesitation, she climbed in, buckled up, and sat still, resting her hands neatly on her lap. Her gaze stayed fixed ahead, polite and unreadable. It took less than 30 seconds for the tension to begin. From the far end of the cabin, Karen Scott spotted her. Tall, in her mid-50s, with perfectly curled blonde hair tucked beneath her cap, Karen had been flying for decades. She prided herself on knowing her cabin before takeoff, like a shepherd counting her flock, and this little girl was off. Karen marched down the aisle with a tight smile. "Excuse me, sweetheart," she said, voice coated with saccharin. "This isn't your seat. First class is up here and you—" Grace turned her head calmly and handed over her phone. The boarding pass screen lit up. Karen took it, glanced once, blinked, then double-checked. 1A, Grace Hill. A flicker of confusion passed across her face, quickly masked with a half-smile. "Must be a system glitch," she muttered. "Just a sec." Before she could step away, a voice from the row behind chimed in. "Probably a mix-up," said a man in his 60s, wearing a navy blazer and gold Rolex. Douglas Price leaned over the armrest. "Looks like someone pulled a scholarship string to sneak in here." He chuckled, loud enough for others to hear. A few nearby passengers smirked, eyes darting to Grace as if watching a child try on a crown in a store window. Karen handed the phone back with exaggerated courtesy. "I'm sure you meant well, dear, but let's have you move to your proper seat while we sort this out." Grace's expression didn't change. Her voice when it came was small but clear. "I'd like to use the restroom before I move." Karen frowned, lips tight but nodded. "Fine, quickly." Grace stood, stepped out of the row without touching anything, and made her way to the lavatory with deliberate steps. Karen watched her go, then leaned toward Douglas. "These parents," she said under her breath, "sending kids to pretend, makes the whole system look cheap." Douglas laughed again. Let's hope she doesn't start screaming next. Inside the restroom, Grace locked the door and stared at herself in the mirror. Her cheeks were calm, not flushed, no tears. She took a slow breath. Then she opened her purse. Tucked inside wasn't a toy or makeup kit. It was a slim smartphone, no case, fingerprint encrypted. She unlocked it in one motion and tapped into an app marked only with a black square and silver dot in the center. The screen flashed once, then displayed a blank interface with one blinking line. Authenticate. Grace pressed her thumb on the scanner. Access granted. 4 new options appeared: report, escalate, silence, override. She tapped report, selected flight discrimination passenger, and typed only 5 words. Immediate violation, Flight 719, 1A. She hit send. The screen blinked once, and a message appeared. Received. Ashwood Connect active. Escalation pending. Maintain current position. She closed the app, locked the phone, and slipped it back into her purse. Then She turned on the faucet, splashed a bit of water on her fingers to simulate washing, dried them, and exited the restroom with the same neutral calm. Karen stood at the end of the aisle, arms crossed. "Okay, miss, let's get you settled in economy now. This seat isn't yours after all." Grace didn't argue. She nodded once and followed the attendant silently through the cabin. As she passed, the atmosphere thickened. Passengers whispered. Someone snickered. "She thought she belonged up front," someone said in a low voice. "Maybe she just got lost," came another reply. At row 32, Karen pointed. "There we go, middle seat, plenty of room." Grace sat down. She adjusted the seatbelt, looked ahead, and rested her hands again on her lap. Same posture, same silence. 2 rows up, Douglas had turned in his seat to sneak another look. "She didn't even cry," he muttered, surprised. Then he smirked. "Cold little thing." He leaned toward the aisle, caught a passing flight attendant, and requested champagne. As she poured, he turned back toward Grace, now staring blankly ahead. He raised the plastic cup. "Cheers, princess." Then, with a small flick of his wrist, he tossed the leftover water in her direction. The splash landed on her knees. The liquid soaked into the thin cotton fabric of her dress. Grace didn't flinch. She didn't move. She looked down, wiped at the spot once, then turned to Douglas. "Thank you," she said, voice even. He blinked. "What?" "You're right. It's dry in here." Then she turned away again, eyes back on the headrest in front of her. What no one saw was that beneath her folded hands, her thumb was tapping her phone again. 1, 2, 3 times. Just enough to activate a secondary ping. Somewhere on the ground, in a secure building in New York, a team was now watching Flight 719, and the clock had just started ticking. The economy cabin was crammed and chaotic, filled with chatter, blinking screens, and the scent of overwarmed plastic meals. Grace sat between a window and a large man in a hoodie who didn't acknowledge her presence. Her knees barely fit in the cramped leg space. The air was dry, the temperature uneven. She could still feel the dampness on her dress from the splash, the fabric clinging to her legs, cold and uncomfortable. No one offered a napkin. No one asked if she was all right. She sat still, eyes steady, posture calm, but her fingers were clasped a little tighter this time. The cart came through, chicken or pasta. The flight attendant moved row by row, her tone chipper, her pace fast. When she reached Grace's row, she stopped at the man beside her. "Chicken or pasta?" "Chicken," the man said, not looking up. The attendant served him, then glanced at Grace briefly, as if debating whether she was worth the delay. Before Grace could speak, the cart had already moved to the next row. She blinked once. They skipped her. It wasn't a mistake. It was a message. She turned her eyes to the tray table in front of her, lowered it, and rested her hands flat. The murmur of the plane faded into a muffled hum, and her mind slipped elsewhere. 2 years ago. Her father sat at the edge of the hotel bed in Zurich, tying his shoes. She was 9 then, small but curious, flipping through a laminated booklet of airline safety instructions even though they weren't flying. "Dad," she asked, "what do you do when someone is mean in public?" Jacob Hill looked up, smiling softly. "Depends what kind of mean, Gracie. When they say you don't belong, or that you're wrong, even though you know you're right." He put his hands on her shoulders. "You listen, you wait, and when they stop talking, you act." She frowned. "But won't they win first?" "They win the noise," he said. "You win the change." Grace opened her eyes. Douglas Price turned toward her from across the aisle, his plastic champagne cup now empty. He raised his eyebrows, smiling as if to signal a truce. "You all right there?" he asked, voice smoother now, public ready. "Bit of a tight fit for a little thing like you." Grace didn't respond. He leaned in. "Didn't mean to startle you earlier. Sometimes I joke too rough. You know how grown-ups are." He chuckled, then tapped the edge of her tray with his cup. "Cheers!" Grace didn't touch her tray. Douglas leaned back again, letting the cup hang loosely in his fingers. His face twitched, not quite a smile, not quite a sneer. He tossed the last drops of champagne forward. Again, they hit her knees. Cold, sticky, intentionally careless. "I keep forgetting, kids don't drink, right?" he said, shaking his head with mock innocence. "Sorry." Around them, a few passengers looked over. One woman blinked. A man shook his head. But no one spoke. No one wanted to get involved. Grace reached into her purse, not with panic, not with trembling, just with deliberation. She pulled out her phone and held it low in her lap. With a subtle tilt, she opened the camera. The screen glowed softly. She lifted it slightly and took 3 pictures. The overhead bin, showing the row number. The tray in front of her, stained with drops of champagne. The aisle, where a flight attendant was walking away again. Then she tapped her encrypted folder, Ashwood Connect. The app opened instantly. This time, she selected Escalate. A prompt appeared. Add visual evidence? She uploaded all 3 photos. Then typed a short message. Repeat targeting. Staff non-responsive. Public mistreatment continues. She hit send. A reply came seconds later. Evidence received. Escalation in progress. ETA, 4 minutes. She closed the app, locked the phone, and slipped it back into her purse. The man beside her adjusted his tray and jostled her elbow without apology. She didn't flinch. The wet spot on her dress had begun to dry, but it left a salty outline against the cotton. She breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth, measured, calm. "Let others talk," she whispered to herself. "You act." In first class, Karen was sipping ginger ale and flipping through her tablet. She scrolled lazily through the manifest again. Something was bothering her. The name, Grace Hill, lingered in her mind. Why did it sound familiar? She tapped into the airline's internal app and pulled up the special status list. Red tags meant frequent flyers. Gold meant VIPs. Purple meant corporate oversight. And then there was black. She paused. There it was. Grace Hill, black flag. Ashwood Group Liaison Tier 1, confidential handling required. Karen froze. She blinked again, hoping she'd read it wrong. But the name didn't change. The tier didn't change. Her throat went dry. Confidential handling was code for "This passenger reports directly to top-level stakeholders." Her fingers hovered above the tablet, unsure what to do next. But it was already too late. Back in economy, Grace was now holding a napkin the man next to her had reluctantly passed over. She dabbed her dress once, gently. Someone behind her whispered, "She's the girl from first class, right?" Another voice replied, "Yeah, got kicked down. Probably couldn't afford the seat." "She's what, 11? 12, maybe." The voices blended into a fog of assumptions and half-facts. Grace didn't correct them. She didn't turn. She simply waited. 3 minutes had passed. 1 more to go. Her thumb tapped her purse lightly. Tick, tick, tick. The timer was counting down, and they didn't even know a clock had started. Somewhere above Arizona, cruising at 36,000 feet, the plane had settled into its dull, predictable hum. Flight attendants were wrapping up their beverage service. Most passengers had reclined slightly, scrolling through movies or dozing off to the hum of the engines. In first class, Karen Scott leaned against the galley counter with a sense of triumph etched across her face. A fellow flight attendant, Maddie, young, new, and eager to please, was stacking snack boxes beside her. Karen smirked. "You should have seen it," she said, voice hushed but giddy. "Little girl sits herself in 1A like she owns the plane. Didn't flinch when I told her to move. Thought she was a diplomat or something." Maddie raised her brows. "Really?" "Oh yeah, I handled it. Quick and clean," Karen continued, chuckling under her breath. "Had her back in economy before she could say, 'Excuse me.' Probably her first time flying anything fancier than a Greyhound." Maddie glanced around uneasily. Was her name Grace something? Grace Hill, Karen said confidently, sipping her ginger ale. Don't worry, I logged the seat correction already. System glitched. Happens. A few seats back, a man in business casual, short-sleeved shirt, laptop still open, had paused his typing. He'd been awake since boarding. Quiet, observant. And now he was recording. His phone, angled casually against his tray table cup holder, was capturing the entire exchange. Karen's tone, her phrasing, her laughter, all of it. He didn't work in tech. He wasn't a journalist. He just hated smug people. When Karen walked off, he uploaded the clip straight to Twitter. Caption: Flight 719, FA Mach's 12-yo girl. Kicked her from 1A for not belonging. Her name was Grace Hill. Hashtag wrong seat right girl. The post didn't need hashtags to catch fire. The algorithm did the rest. Within 5 minutes, it had 400 retweets. Down in the economy cabin, Grace didn't need to scroll to know. She had faith in the world's sense of irony. But above her, the air shifted. Literally. The lighting in the aircraft subtly changed. White to a faint bluish hue, then back again. Most passengers didn't notice. Some thought it was turbulence. But one man near the emergency exit looked up and froze. He was a former flight technician, and he recognized it instantly. Cabin code 47. It was a quiet, rarely used signal. Internally, it alerted the staff. An escalation request has been flagged from top-tier authority. Await protocol. Maddie returned to her seat at the front and checked her in-flight terminal. Something flashed. Passenger manifest override request. She blinked. That was uncommon. She tapped into the secure manifest using her access code. A new label was blinking beside a single name. Grace Hill, Tier 1 Black. Do not reassign. Immediate review required. Her heart sank. She quickly tapped the crew chat. Maddie, did we move a Grace Hill from 1A? Crew chat. System, reply. Confirmed by K. Scott. System override flagged. Internal alert pending. Await instructions. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Maddie, we have a problem. Karen, meanwhile, was in the forward galley, brushing crumbs from her hands when her tablet buzzed. She glanced down and saw internal alert, code 47 initiated. Then another, internal escalation. Passenger Grace Hill, special handling breach. Her face drained of color. What the hell? She muttered. She tapped furiously through the interface, trying to access details. Blocked. Access restricted. Maddie arrived at the galley seconds later. Karen, she said in a hushed voice. We need to talk, right now. Karen's voice sharpened. What did you do? Maddie shook her head. It's not me, it's her, that girl. She's black tear. Karen's hand dropped to her side. Her tablet buzzed again. Corporate flagged. Internal media activity detected. She turned to the window, pressing a hand against the glass. The outside world was peaceful, but inside, panic bloomed. In row 32, Grace hadn't moved. She was now quietly nibbling on a granola bar she had packed in her purse. Her phone buzzed lightly once, but she didn't check it yet. Her mind was counting down. She knew how long it usually took from escalation to action. 5 minutes, maximum. She could feel it happening. The pause in the attendants' voices, the slight change in pressure. Even the background music had been switched. Barely noticeable unless one was trained to hear such things. Grace, at 12, had learned to listen in silence. She glanced at the screen on the seat in front of her, playing a wildlife documentary. A flock of birds was fleeing a forest fire in slow motion. Grace smiled slightly. At the front, Douglas noticed the flight attendants gathering in the galley, whispering hurriedly. He straightened in his seat. Is something wrong? He asked Karen as she walked by. No, sir, Karen replied quickly. All fine. But her voice had lost its edge. Her posture had lost its pride. She kept moving toward the cockpit. Meanwhile, the man in seat 14C, the one who had posted the video, noticed his phone vibrating again. He opened Twitter. His post had crossed 10,000 shares. Mentions were flooding in. This isn't just a mean flight attendant. This is power abuse. Grace Hill. Why does that name sound familiar? Someone find out who her parents are. Then, someone posted a photo from a charity gala from last year's Ashwood Foundation fundraiser. There was Grace, standing beside her father, Jacob Hill, chairman of Ashwood Global Holdings. The caption under the image? Grace Hill, daughter of one of the most powerful financiers in the U.S. The cabin lights flickered again. This time, people noticed. Grace closed her eyes. Right on schedule. At precisely 5:42 p.m., the cabin door opened mid-air, a rare protocol reserved only for the highest tiers of corporate security clearances. No one noticed it happen at first. The door hadn't physically opened, of course, but the system had been accessed remotely, triggering a shadow boarding signal. From the first-class bulkhead, a new figure stepped into the aisle. He wore a slate gray suit with a subtle lapel pin shaped like an eagle's talon wrapped around a globe. His face was unreadable, like polished marble. No smile, no twitch, just professional gravity. He moved with the deliberate calm of someone who had walked into many storms and never once gotten wet. His name was Marcus Ellery, Senior Operations Liaison, known inside the aviation world only by codename Stormglass. The passengers in first class quieted immediately. He didn't make eye contact. He scanned the cabin with a glance and stepped into the galley where Karen was frantically scrolling through her device, attempting to undo what had already unraveled. He showed her his badge. Ellery, Corporate Liaison, Level 5 Oversight. Karen's throat clicked as she swallowed. "We need to talk," he said flatly. In economy, Grace's phone buzzed once. No notification, just the programmed vibration pattern she knew. 3 short pulses, 1 long. She didn't react. She simply closed her eyes for a moment, inhaled, and opened them again. Then she stood up, smoothed her dress, and stepped into the aisle. A flight attendant who had been walking toward her stopped in place, startled. "Miss Hill," the woman said, voice tense. "You've been requested to return to your assigned seat." Grace nodded politely. "I'm aware. May I speak to your liaison?" The attendant blinked, uncertain. Grace added gently, "Level 5. Her tone wasn't arrogant. It wasn't even loud. But it carried weight. A weight that didn't come from age or volume, but from certainty. Moments later, she stood at the curtain between first class and main cabin. Marcus Ellery stepped forward. He didn't speak first. Grace did. "I appreciate the prompt response," she said, "but I'm not ready to return yet." Ellery studied her for a moment. He'd been warned she was sharp, but this was more than that. "Do you mind explaining?" Grace kept her eyes level with his. "I don't want a private correction. I want this entire process recorded, fully, transparently. If we solve this quietly, it gets buried quietly, and the next child gets treated like I was." He said nothing for a long moment. Then he tapped his earpiece once. "Begin recording," he said into the mic. A tone played overhead, audible only to staff. "Code, full record mode engaged. Proceed, Miss Hill." Karen sat in a jump seat near the front, tablet trembling slightly in her hands. She looked up as Ellery approached, Grace by his side. The girl's steps were composed, her back straight. "Karen Scott," Ellery began, "you are currently under internal investigation for violation of handling protocols related to high-clearance passengers." Karen's voice cracked. I didn't know." "That is not an excuse," he interrupted. "Your statements, actions, and discretionary behavior are being recorded for review. Please do not speak unless instructed." He turned to Grace. "Your preferred seat is now available." Grace shook her head slightly. "Not yet." Karen frowned. "What more do you want?" Grace looked at her. Finally, her words were simple. "I want you to listen." Karen scoffed, but Ellery raised a hand. "Proceed, Miss Hill." Grace didn't raise her voice. She didn't even look around to check who was watching. "I'm 12, she said. "I boarded alone, dressed simply." "You didn't see a child. You saw someone beneath you, and when you assumed I didn't belong, you didn't ask. You acted." Karen opened her mouth but thought better of it. Grace continued, "You mocked me out loud in front of strangers. You called me a charity case. You moved me, not because of policy, but because of pride. You wanted to feel powerful, and you chose a quiet girl to make small." The entire first-class cabin had gone still. Even Douglas, several rows back, had turned pale. "And yet," Grace said, "I still believe in policy. So I requested this, not revenge, but record. Not apology, but accountability." Ellery nodded once, slowly. From his earpiece came a confirmation tone. The Ashwood internal line had just received her statement. He tapped his tablet. The message displayed across all senior terminals across the Ashwood Aviation Network. "Escalation request approved. Elevated to Division of Ethics and Communications. Apply 5-minute protocol." 5-minute protocol was a special tier of internal justice, created not for public relations, but for reform. It required 3 things: full transparency, public acknowledgement within 1 business day, mandatory restructuring of protocol for any verified violation. Karen's career wasn't just suspended, it had just been handed to the ethics division. She slumped in her seat. Grace turned to Ellery. "I'd like to return to 1A now." He nodded. She walked past Karen, never breaking pace. As she sat down, a fresh glass of water was already on her tray table, a warm towel, a silent, retracted apology from the airline. She didn't touch them. She looked out the window. From the back of the cabin, passengers were whispering. A man who'd seen the girl move past him now opened Twitter. His timeline had exploded. "That's wrong, seat right" girl was trending globally. A new post had appeared. Someone from the flight had filmed Grace's quiet confrontation with Karen. The video was already at 70,000 views and rising by the second. Back at Ashwood headquarters, Jacob Hill watched the clip. He didn't smile. He just said to his aide, "Send the message to internal communications. Tell them, this isn't about Grace. It's about everyone else who doesn't have a button to press." The soft chime of the cabin speaker system broke the silence with an uncharacteristic urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," came the steady voice from the cockpit. "Due to an unexpected internal incident, we will be conducting a procedural integrity check as mandated by corporate regulation. This will not affect the safety or duration of our flight. Thank you for your cooperation." The captain's words were polished, vague, but the tension they left behind was sharp enough to slice the cabin air. Row by row, passengers turned to each other with the same unspoken question: "What's happening?" In first class, Karen Scott's knuckles whitened on the armrest. She'd been sitting in frozen silence since Grace returned to 1A. Now, her heart raced. She looked up just as the red light above the galley door flashed. An internal summons signal. Marcus Ellery appeared beside her. "Ms. Scott," he said quietly, "you are required to accompany me forward. Mr. Price as well." Douglas, sipping his second glass of wine, looked up in confusion. "What for? What is this about?" "Protocol compliance check," Ellery replied. Karen rose slowly. Her face had lost its practiced cheer, replaced now with something brittle and pale. She followed Ellery down the aisle like someone marching to a verdict already written. Douglas scoffed, still holding his glass. "You've got to be joking." Another attendant stepped in. "Sir, please come with us." "On whose authority?" he barked. The attendant simply gestured to the gray-suited Ellery and added, "Level 5. Douglas blinked. His expression shifted from indignation to unease. He stood reluctantly and followed them forward, brushing crumbs from his jacket. The curtain closed behind them. Back in 1A, Grace didn't turn her head. She sat still, her posture identical to the moment she'd first taken the seat. Her hands rested neatly on her lap. Her eyes were on the clouds beyond the window. To anyone watching, she looked like a child trying her best not to be noticed. But in reality, she was the quiet center of the storm. The control wasn't in her tone, her expression, or even her seat. It was in the fact that every part of this process, Every signal, every escalation, every silence had been set in motion by her deliberate choice to report, to wait, and to act. Karen and Douglas had talked. Now it was Grace's turn to teach. Inside the forward cabin, a small screen had been deployed against the bulkhead, visible only to the attendants and the summoned. Ellery tapped a command into his tablet. The screen came to life with the Ashwood logo, silver over black. A countdown appeared, 0045. Karen shifted in place. "What is this?" "Live statement from Ashwood Group," Ellery replied. "You're part of the protocol review." Douglas scoffed. "Are you seriously broadcasting this mid-flight?" Ellery looked at him evenly. "You're free to remove yourself from the program, but given the content, I'd advise you stay." The timer hit 0. A woman appeared on screen, seated behind a sleek desk. She wore a navy blazer, glasses, and the calm precision of someone used to speaking when stakes were high. "Good evening. I'm Elise Rowan, Senior Director of Ethics and Communications at Ashwood Group. We are addressing an urgent matter that arose today aboard Flight 799 en route from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. Karen swallowed audibly. Elise continued. "A report was filed internally concerning the treatment of one of our registered high-clearance passengers, Miss Grace Hill. The report included accusations of discrimination, verbal mistreatment, and targeted humiliation by airline staff and another passenger." Douglas stiffened. Karen's hands trembled. The screen displayed a blurred image of the economy cabin, a still from one of the photos Grace had submitted. The time code blinked in the corner. "This incident has triggered a Tier 1 5-minute protocol," Elise said, "which mandates immediate transparency and systemic response." She paused, then added with quiet firmness, "Miss Hill's status within our organization does not exempt her from scrutiny, but it demands she be treated with the same respect and dignity we owe every customer. The footage and testimonies received suggest that standard was not met." Douglas's jaw twitched. Karen stared ahead, breathing unevenly. "We are not here to punish," Elise concluded. "We are here to rebuild trust, with every employee, every partner, and every person who boards a flight believing they will be treated with fairness." The screen faded to black. A single line appeared. "This matter will be handled with full transparency. A report will be available publicly within 24 hours. Then the screen shut off. Ellery turned toward them. "You'll both be issued temporary suspensions pending the review. Coordination with legal and PR will occur upon landing. Compliance is mandatory." Karen stammered, I didn't know who she was." Ellery nodded. "And that's the point." Douglas raised his voice. "This is ridiculous. I was just making conversation. I didn't threaten her." "Your recorded actions and verbal comments have been submitted," Ellery said evenly. "The review board will evaluate accordingly." In 1A, Grace sipped from her glass of water. The screen in front of her now displayed a message. "Press available tomorrow. Public apology, optional. Internal reform, guaranteed." She read it once, then tapped the screen off. She didn't need the apology. She needed the change. On the ground, in Ashwood's media war room, engineers, legal consultants, and PR experts were compiling a response package. One of them, a young staffer in glasses, whispered to a colleague, "This is like a blueprint case. Textbook mistreatment." The colleague nodded. "And it'll be studied for years." Back in the air, passengers were buzzing. Some had now heard enough to understand something significant had occurred. A man opened his news app and blinked. The top story: Grace Hill, 12-year-old passenger, sparks corporate reform mid-flight. Below it, a still image of her seated calmly, back straight, eyes distant. In the galley, Karen sat hunched forward, eyes red, as Ellery prepared to document her final statement. Douglas refused to speak. He simply leaned back, arms crossed, defeated and seething. And at the center of it all, the girl they had both dismissed had just rewritten the entire flight's legacy. By the time Flight 719 crossed into East Coast airspace, the digital world had already exploded. CNN's homepage refreshed with a breaking headline: Silent passengers' rights violated on Flight 79. Ashwood confirms internal investigation. NBC followed minutes later with an alert on its mobile app. 12-year-old business heir removed from first class. Corporate repercussions underway. The story was irresistible. A young girl in first class, pulled from her seat by a smug flight attendant and a wealthy passenger, later revealed to be the daughter of one of the most powerful financial executives in America. But it wasn't just the name that lit the internet on fire. It was the video. The footage showed Karen grabbing Grace's arm, gesturing aggressively toward the back cabin, her tone sharp. Grace's reaction, by contrast, was hauntingly calm. No screaming, no crying, just quiet acceptance. It was posted first by a flight passenger, then downloaded, edited, and replayed with music overlays, emotional captions, and even animated breakdowns. One version began with the words, "She didn't speak, but she changed everything." By the hour, hashtags mounted. Wrong seat right girl at Grace Hill, Ashwood Standard. The world didn't just sympathize, they rallied. Back on the plane, Grace didn't check her phone. She didn't need to. The quiet vibrations in her purse had stopped. That meant only one thing. Phase 3 was complete. Full external media handoff authorized. The machine had begun its work. Yet she remained composed, seated, polite, disengaged from the noise around her. To most on board, she was still just a kid. But inside, she was watching a chessboard play out exactly as she and her father had designed it. Her eyes flicked once toward first class row 2. Douglas Price sat stiffly, arms folded, head low. She knew exactly who he was. 3 years earlier, Grace had wandered into her father's study late one evening, unable to sleep. He was on a call, speaking in clipped, low tones. "No, Doug. We offered fair terms. You tried to undercut with off-the-books deals. That's not competition, that's sabotage." A pause. "If you ever try to pull a stunt like that again, the board won't just remove you, they'll bury you." The call ended, and Jacob Hill had turned to find Grace watching him silently from the doorway. "Is Douglas Price a bad guy?" she had asked. Jacob smiled sadly. "He's not evil, he's just small. And small men think the only way to feel big is by stepping on someone smaller." Grace had remembered that. So when she'd seen Douglas board Flight 719 at the gate, her breath had caught, but only for a second. She didn't react, didn't change seats, didn't even look at him twice. She wanted him to feel untouchable. So when he mocked her, insulted her, and drenched her in wine, she let him. Because now the world could watch him destroy himself. In New York, a junior reporter named Daniela Torres had been assigned to cover the Ashwood scandal. Her editor wasn't convinced there was more than a corporate PR incident, until Daniela ran a name check on the manifest. "Wait," she whispered, pulling up archived finance records. "Douglas Price?" She leaned closer to her monitor. There it was. 2017, SEC audit. Alleged insider trading 2018. Lawsuit filed for discriminatory hiring practices 2020. Removed from board position after racial comments during merger negotiations. It wasn't enough for conviction, but it was enough for perception. And perception, in public scandal, is everything. 2 hours later, her article hit the web. Grace Hill flight incident unveils passengers' shady past. Who is Douglas Price? Within minutes, the story was picked up by media outlets worldwide. A former PR executive tweeted, "Did Price really throw wine at the daughter of Ashwood's CEO on camera with his past?" The collective response was swift and vicious. Sponsors of Douglas's current firm began pulling support. One released a statement, "We are reviewing our relationship pending a full investigation." Another terminated the contract outright. On board, Douglas had gone from irritated to trapped. His phone buzzed endlessly with alerts. His email inbox overflowed. Calls were coming in from his assistant, legal team, and even his wife. He tried to stand once, walk the aisle, but the stairs pushed him back into his seat. He was no longer the man laughing at a child. He was a man everyone was watching fall. Karen, too, was watching the downfall unfold. But unlike Douglas, she had no empire, no PR team, no golden parachute. All she had was a shrinking sense of identity and the heavy realization that her quick and clean moment of power had cost her everything. In the crew galley, Maddie approached with sympathy in her eyes. "They're publishing the report," she whispered. "Global Ethics flagged it as a model case. You're in it." Karen couldn't respond. Grace finally pulled out her phone, not to check the news, but to type one simple message into Ashwood Connect. Phase 3 complete. All systems aligned. A second later, a confirmation came back. "Final phase pending. You may now disengage." She locked the screen. A passenger across the aisle leaned over. "Miss Grace, right?" She turned politely. "I just wanted to say, what you did, it mattered." Grace offered a small nod. "Thank you. But how did you stay so calm?" Her answer was simple. "Because I wasn't alone." Her father had taught her that power wasn't in shouting, but in systems, in preparing for storms before they arrive, in giving people the chance to reveal themselves, then letting the truth speak louder than outrage. And now the manifest was clear. It no longer read passenger, Douglas Price. It read liability, public. The decision came in a silent message. Karen Scott stood near the front galley, shoulders squared but trembling. Her tablet buzzed one final time with a red-bordered notification she hoped she'd never see. "Status update. Flight crew. Temporary suspension. Effective immediately. Await ground processing." No meeting, no phone call, no hearing. Just a line of digital text that carried more finality than any courtroom gavel. Maddie, the junior attendant, watched as Karen slumped against the bulkhead, breathing unevenly. She didn't gloat. She didn't speak. There was only a kind of awkward stillness, as if even sympathy might feel like mockery now. In the crew chat system, a new notice appeared, flashing across all their devices. Internal audit initiated. Full review of employee conduct, group communications, and incident response history. Deadline, 12 hours. That line hit harder than turbulence. It meant that nothing, no message, no forwarded meme, no sarcastic emoji, was safe. The system would scan it all, and if your name was tied to even one offhand comment or ignored protocol, you were at risk. A ripple of anxiety swept through the crew. One attendant quietly turned off her phone. Another began deleting old screenshots from a group thread, but it was already too late. Grace had asked for transparency, and Ashwood was giving her all of it. Meanwhile, back in 1A, Grace Hill had returned to her seat with the kind of quiet ceremony usually reserved for royalty. She walked down the aisle without a word, every eye following her, every passenger instinctively leaning out of her way. There were no more sneers, no more sideways glances, just silence. She sat back down, pulled the seatbelt over her lap, and adjusted her posture with practiced grace. Her hands folded in her lap again, calm, in control, unreadable. The girl who had once been seen as a trespasser now sat like a monument, and yet she smiled, not triumphantly, not arrogantly, but softly, as if the storm had passed and she was simply watching the clouds part. Douglas had not spoken in nearly an hour. His face was a pale mask of defeat. His hands, which once waved with grand gestures, now stayed clenched on his thighs. He knew the cameras were watching, not just real ones. Everyone's phones, the eyes of witnesses, the watching world on social media. Every move now meant something, so he sat still, silent, like a ghost in a suit. Just as the aircraft crossed over Pennsylvania, preparing for final descent into Washington, an elderly man rose from his seat in row 7. His jacket was faded, his gait slow but steady. He walked gently toward first class, passing the curtain without hesitation. The cabin crew tensed, but no one stopped him. He paused beside Grace's seat, and for a moment, didn't say a word. Then, in a voice worn but warm, he spoke. "I don't know if it means much, miss," he said, "but on behalf of, well, people like me, people who stayed quiet, I'm sorry." Grace looked up, meeting his eyes. There was no judgment in hers, no cruelty, just quiet calculation. Then she smiled again, a smile like frost catching sunlight. "Merci," she said softly, her French accent precise and elegant. "Mais je n'oublie pas." The man blinked. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone, and he nodded, placing a gentle hand over his heart before turning back to his seat. A nearby passenger, fluent in French, whispered the translation to their seatmate. "Thank you, but I don't forget." That phrase would echo across the internet within the hour. It became the closing line in dozens of tribute videos, think pieces, and campaign speeches. It wasn't bitter. It was simply sharp. The kind of response that left no wound, just awareness. Later, during the descent checklist, a flight attendant approached Grace with a tray containing hot towels and a handwritten note from the cockpit. Grace accepted it wordlessly, glanced at the handwriting, and tucked it into her purse. Then she turned to the woman and said in perfect Mandarin, "Ni men de chuli yi jing zugo, bushu yao zai duo." "Your response has been sufficient. Nothing further is needed." The attendant stared, stunned, unsure whether to bow or respond. She just nodded and stepped away. A man across the aisle muttered, "Was that Chinese?" "No," his seatmate replied. "Mandarin. Fluent." Whispers spread again. "She speaks French. She speaks Mandarin? How many languages does she know? Who is this girl?" Grace stared out the window again, unfazed. The truth was, she knew 6, and she never bragged about any of them. Because knowing wasn't power. Choosing when to speak was. The seatbelt signs came on. The captain began his descent briefing. Passengers sat straighter, quieter, as if the weight of the past few hours had pressed them all into reflection. Karen still sat near the galley, awaiting further instructions. Her hands were clasped together, knuckles white. Her uniform, still crisp, now felt like a costume. The authority it once carried had crumbled into fabric. Douglas didn't move. No one spoke to him. No one even looked. Grace remained still, her hands exactly as they had been when the flight began. They had boarded a flight expecting a quiet route from LA to DC, but they had landed inside a moment of history. The decision came in a silent message. Karen Scott stood near the front galley, shoulders squared but trembling. Her tablet buzzed one final time with a red-bordered notification she hoped she'd never see. "Status update. Flight crew. Temporary suspension. Effective immediately. Await ground processing." No meeting, no phone call, no hearing. Just a line of digital text that carried more finality than any courtroom gavel. Maddie, the junior attendant, watched as Karen slumped against the bulkhead, breathing unevenly. She didn't gloat. She didn't speak. There was only a kind of awkward stillness, as if even sympathy might feel like mockery now. In the crew chat system, a new notice appeared, flashing across all their devices. Internal audit initiated. Full review of employee conduct, group communications, and incident response history. Deadline, 12 hours. That line hit harder than turbulence. It meant that nothing, no message, no forwarded meme, no sarcastic emoji, was safe. The system would scan it all. And if your name was tied to even one offhand comment or ignored protocol, you were at risk. A ripple of anxiety swept through the crew. One attendant quietly turned off her phone. Another began deleting old screenshots from a group thread. But it was already too late. Grace had asked for transparency, and Ashwood was giving her all of it. Meanwhile, back in 1A, Grace Hill had returned to her seat with the kind of quiet ceremony usually reserved for royalty. She walked down the aisle without a word, every eye following her, every passenger instinctively leaning out of her way. There were no more sneers, no more sideways glances, just silence. She sat back down, pulled the seatbelt over her lap, and adjusted her posture with practiced grace. Her hands folded in her lap again, calm, in control, unreadable. The girl who had once been seen as a trespasser now sat like a monument, and yet she smiled, not triumphantly, not arrogantly, but softly, as if the storm had passed and she was simply watching the clouds part. Douglas had not spoken in nearly an hour. His face was a pale mask of defeat. His hands, which once waved with grand gestures, now stayed clenched on his thighs. He knew the cameras were watching, not just real ones, everyone's phones, the eyes of witnesses, the watching world on social media. Every move now meant something. So he sat still, silent, like a ghost in a suit. Just as the aircraft crossed over Pennsylvania, preparing for final descent into Washington, an elderly man rose from his seat in row 7. His jacket was faded, his gait slow but steady. He walked gently toward first class, passing the curtain without hesitation. The cabin crew tensed, but no one stopped him. He paused beside Grace's seat, and for a moment, didn't say a word. Then, in a voice worn but warm, he spoke. "I don't know if it means much, miss," he said, "but on behalf of, well, people like me, people who stayed quiet, I'm sorry." Grace looked up, meeting his eyes. There was no judgment in hers, no cruelty, just quiet calculation. Then she smiled again, a smile like frost catching sunlight. "Merci," she said softly, her French accent precise and elegant. "Mais je n'oublie pas." The man blinked. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone, and he nodded, placing a gentle hand over his heart before turning back to his seat. A nearby passenger, fluent in French, whispered the translation to their seatmate. "Thank you, but I don't forget." That phrase would echo across the internet within the hour. It became the closing line in dozens of tribute videos, think pieces, and campaign speeches. It wasn't bitter. It was simply sharp. The kind of response that left no wound, just awareness. Later, during the descent checklist, a flight attendant approached Grace with a tray containing hot towels and a handwritten note from the cockpit. Grace accepted it wordlessly, glanced at the handwriting, and tucked it into her purse. Then, she turned to the woman and said in perfect Mandarin, "Ni men de chuli yi jing zu go, bu shu yao zai duo." Your response has been sufficient. Nothing further is needed. The attendant stared, stunned, unsure whether to bow or respond. She just nodded and stepped away. A man across the aisle muttered, "Was that Chinese?" "No," his seatmate replied. "Mandarin. Fluent." Whispers spread again. "She speaks French. She speaks Mandarin? How many languages does she know? Who is this girl?" Grace stared out the window again, unfazed. The truth was, she knew 6, and she never bragged about any of them, because knowing wasn't power. Choosing when to speak was. The seatbelt signs came on. The captain began his descent briefing. Passengers sat straighter, quieter, as if the weight of the past few hours had pressed them all into reflection. Karen still sat near the galley, awaiting further instructions. Her hands were clasped together, knuckles white. Her uniform, still crisp, now felt like a costume. The authority it once carried had crumbled into fabric. Douglas didn't move. No one spoke to him. No one even looked. Grace remained still, her hands exactly as they had been when the flight began. They had boarded a flight expecting a quiet route from LA to DC, but they had landed inside a moment of history. By the time Flight 799 landed at Reagan National Airport, the plane was no longer just a method of transport. It had become a case study, a symbol, a spark. But for Karen Scott, it was a coffin lined in digital ink. Within 20 minutes of touchdown, internal audit files from Ashwood's aviation division were leaked, not to the press, but to internal staff, partner airlines, and key stakeholders across the corporate chain. The headline of the memo read bluntly, "Conduct review. Flight staff, KS799, Karen Scott. Below that, a timeline. May 2018. Complaint by passenger regarding tone and dismissiveness during medical incident. October 2019. Co-worker reported verbal harassment in crew chat. No action taken. June 2021. Filed warning from supervisor regarding racial insensitivity during a gate delay. December 2002. Parent filed complaint regarding treatment of a disabled child seated alone. Deemed inconclusive. Each of these incidents had been cataloged, tagged, and quietly archived. Never escalated. Never resolved. Until now. The report concluded, internal protections failed to prevent repeat behavior. Tier 1 protocol triggered by Miss Grace Hill shall now be used as precedent for future conduct review escalation. The line that followed hit harder than any PR release. Karen Scott is no longer employed by Ashwood or its affiliates. Far from the boardrooms and terminals, in a quiet apartment in Phoenix, a retired flight attendant named Selena Torres scrolled through the report with glassy eyes. She knew that name. Karen Scott. Back in 2019, they'd served together on a series of domestic routes. Selena had filed a complaint after being called too emotional for uniformed work by Karen, who later told the crew she'd rescued a flight from a soft-handed wreck. Selena had reported it. The airline had acknowledged her feedback. Nothing more. But now Grace had done something Selena couldn't. Selena opened her email and began to write. Subject: formal reinforcement of prior complaint in support of Grace Hill body. I wish to confirm the validity of your audit on Karen Scott. I was witness to her behavior in 2019 and attempted to flag it. I regret not pushing further. Grace Hill's courage has opened a door many of us thought would remain shut forever. Selena Torres. Meanwhile, Grace stood near the arrival gate, surrounded by a subtle circle of respect. Not attention, just space. Passengers gave her room to breathe, not because they were told to, but because something about her demanded it without words. She still hadn't touched her phone except to send one final system message. Landing confirmed, standing down. But just as she turned toward the baggage claim, a woman approached, mid-40s, business suit, travel-worn eyes. Miss Hill? Grace turned, nodding politely. The woman smiled, then held out a letter, not typed, not formal, just handwritten, folded twice, a thumbprint on the corner. I wrote this on the plane, she said. Didn't know if I'd have the guts to give it to you, but I just wanted to say, what you did? You didn't just do it for you. Grace accepted the letter. You did it for all of us, the woman finished. Grace didn't reply with a speech. She simply said, thank you, but she meant it. And more people came, one by one. A father with a baby in arms, a college student in sweats, an elderly woman holding a neck pillow. Even Maddie, the junior flight attendant, walked over and nodded solemnly, whispering, you changed the rules. Grace said little. She didn't need to. The silence that followed her now was no longer one of doubt. It was one of respect. In a quiet black car en route to her family's townhouse in Georgetown, Grace finally allowed herself a glance at her tablet. The screen was lit with messages, not from her father, not from corporate, but from the ethics team. New policy draft, passenger tier protocol to be named after Case Hill GH1, review pending. She stared at it for a moment, then tapped the file open. Elsewhere, on the West Coast, a group of law students gathered in a library study room, dissecting the incident for a seminar. They played the video where Grace simply sat still as a glass of wine was tossed her way. She never even flinched, one of them said. That's what's terrifying, another replied. That's how you know it wasn't her first time. They weren't wrong. 3 years ago, Grace had been on a smaller flight. She had been misidentified as unaccompanied, even though she carried a full ticket and clearance. A flight attendant had asked her, twice, to return to the back until your guardian shows up. She hadn't reported it, not then. She was 9, and she'd gone home and cried quietly in the laundry room. Her father had found her and said, sometimes The world will try to confuse small with powerless. Let it, then prove them wrong later. This had been later, and now the record would remember. Outside the airport, a reporter tried to get a quote from a passing executive. "What do you say to people calling her the Ice Princess?" The executive paused, then replied, "I say she was fire. She just didn't need to raise her voice to burn the system down." The wheels touched down on the tarmac with a subtle jolt, quieter than usual. But the tension inside Flight 719 was anything but subtle. The intercom clicked on. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been directed to land temporarily in Honolulu International for a mandatory aviation review protocol. Please remain seated as we complete a short inspection process. We appreciate your patience." The captain's voice was steady, yet the words struck like thunder. Honolulu? This wasn't Washington, D.C. Confused whispers rippled through the cabin, but the voice left no room for debate. Grace didn't flinch. She knew. This was the endgame. As the plane taxied toward a secluded terminal, the truth became unavoidable. Outside the windows, through the humid Hawaiian haze, a team of uniformed aviation regulators and legal representatives waited. Some wore blazers embroidered with the FAA seal. Others carried notepads, briefcases, and hard stares. One woman clutched a press badge from the Wall Street Journal. Beside her stood a quiet man with a legal satchel, and at the front of the line, a senior Ashwood aviation auditor, tablet already glowing in hand. The plane came to a halt. The door opened. No music, no fanfare, just the hiss of pressure and the sharp inhale of consequence. Marcus Ellery stepped into the galley and gave a nod to the cabin crew. "Karen Scott and Douglas Price, please gather your personal belongings and step forward." Karen stood with visible hesitation. Her movements were robotic, drained. She tried to hold her chin up, but her uniform felt like a disguise that had finally been unmasked. Douglas, too, rose, though with less grace. He muttered under his breath and yanked his carry-on from the overhead bin, nearly knocking over another passenger's bag. No one offered to help him. No one made eye contact. They walked forward together, a mirror image of disgrace. One once cloaked in authority, the other in arrogance. Now, both exposed. At the doorway, they were greeted not with handshakes but with folders, sealed, stamped, and thick with accusations. The FAA agent spoke softly but clearly. "You are both being held for formal inquiry regarding passenger mistreatment, flight protocol violations, and internal policy obstruction. You may request counsel upon disembarkation." Neither replied. They were escorted away down the jet bridge, swallowed by a team of legal and aviation officers. Inside the cabin, passengers began murmuring again, this time not in fear, but with a mix of relief and disbelief. They had seen justice happen in real time, not in a courtroom, not on a headline, but right in the aisle beside them. One passenger muttered, "They'll never forget this flight." Another added, "We just watched the rules change." Grace sat unmoved. But behind her, in 2D, a woman finally stood. She was quiet, composed. Her blouse simple, her posture impeccable. Her face had been unreadable for most of the flight. She had read a paperback, sipped tea, and barely spoken a word. No one had noticed her, and that was the point. She stepped up beside Grace now, gently resting a hand on her shoulder. Grace looked up and smiled, not surprised. The woman gave a small nod, as if to say, "You passed." A passenger nearby leaned toward another, whispering, "Is that her mom?" They didn't know her name, but within minutes, others would. Claire Hill, media strategist, head of Ashwood Global's Crisis Communication Division, former White House comms advisor, nicknamed the mind behind the curtain in corporate circles. She had flown the entire time under the alias Elise Gardner, booked separately from Grace, sitting 2 rows back, observing everything. She could have intervened, could have flashed her credentials, could have shut the whole thing down at the first sign of trouble. But she hadn't. because this had been Grace's test. Back at Ashwood headquarters, Jacob Hill received the final message. Subject completed flight unaided. Independent escalation initiated, executed, and resolved. No intervention required. He exhaled slowly, closing the message. Then he whispered to himself, "She's ready." On the tarmac, reporters began to gather beyond the secured area. Microphones were checked, cameras adjusted. They weren't here for a scandal anymore. They were here for a legacy. Back on board, Grace turned to her mother. "Did you think I'd break?" Claire's voice was soft. "No, I wondered if you'd fight." Grace tilted her head. "And? You didn't fight," Claire said. "You led." The two sat side by side for the first time since takeoff, a silence between them filled with understanding. They weren't mother and daughter right now. They were colleagues, strategists, generals who had just closed a campaign. Somewhere mid-cabin, a teenager looked down at his phone. He'd been watching videos of the event unfold since takeoff. Now, seeing the reveal, he whispered, "She played everyone." His sister beside him replied, "She didn't play. She prepared." At the front of the cabin, Maddie handed Grace a small envelope. "From the pilot," she said. Inside was a card, one line handwritten. "Passengers don't usually steer flights, but sometimes the right one changes course for everyone." Grace smiled. She folded the card and slid it into her journal. And with that, the final boarding door sealed. Not for a flight, but for the girl the world had underestimated, now preparing to enter it as a force no one would forget. The sun over Honolulu cast long golden shadows across the tarmac as Grace Hill walked toward her next flight, not as a passenger shuffled along with the crowd, but as someone deliberately escorted. A pair of uniformed airline representatives flanked her sides. They didn't speak unless she did. One held her boarding pass like a sacred artifact. The other coordinated security clearance with a clipboard bearing a gold-stamped Ashwood seal. Reporters tried to get close at the perimeter fence. Cameras zoomed. Microphones pointed. But the only footage they managed to capture was a 12-year-old girl, walking quietly, hands folded behind her back, eyes steady on the jet bridge ahead. There were no speeches, no smiles. She wasn't there to perform. Inside the VIP corridor, an agent gestured toward the private lounge. "Miss Hill, this way, please. The Ashwood Executive Lounge is fully prepared for you. Private menu, reclining cabin, even your favorite teas." Grace looked at the woman kindly, then shook her head once. "I'm not royalty," she said softly. "Just someone who watched and acted." The agent blinked, unsure how to respond. Grace continued walking toward the gate. Behind her, the lounge doors remained unopened. Back at Ashwood headquarters, her father watched her steps via a secure live stream, not because she needed protection, but because he knew how much weight those small choices carried. Declining the lounge wouldn't make headlines, but for those watching closely, it said everything. She wasn't cashing in. She was showing up. The new flight had been specially scheduled, its seat manifest cleared for priority repositioning. Grace was offered a luxury pod, lay-flat seating, personal attendant. She asked for a normal seat instead. Row 8, window. The attendant hesitated. "Are you sure?" Grace nodded. "Let's keep it honest." She boarded quietly, slipping past business class and into the main cabin. A few passengers recognized her immediately. One man lowered his phone in awe. A child nudged their mother, whispering, "It's her!" No one asked for photos. Somehow, they sensed she wouldn't want that. As the plane ascended, Grace looked out at the sky not as an escape, but as a witness. She wasn't leaving behind a chapter. She was ascending towards something new. By the time the flight reached cruising altitude, the email had already landed in inboxes across the globe. Subject: International Passenger Rights Forum, keynote invitation. To Grace Hill, from Geneva Passenger Advocacy Council. Message: in light of recent events, we extend an invitation for you to speak at the 18th Global Passenger Rights Summit in Geneva, Switzerland. You have become a symbol not of resistance, but of restoration. a reminder that passengers are more than customers. They are people. She read the message once, then again. She could feel the gravity of it. Being handed a microphone, a stage, a headline, it would be easy to accept. Everyone expected it. Instead, she opened her camera. She turned the lens toward the window, framed by soft light. No filters, no edits. And she took one photo. Clouds, sky, stillness. She attached it to her reply and typed only one sentence. "My voice is silence." She hit send. The photo would go viral within 24 hours. People debated it on television. What did it mean? Was she refusing the spotlight? Was it a statement about dignity? A lawyer tweeted, "She's saying the system should speak for itself, not scream only when it's wounded." A poet posted, "Silence isn't surrender, it's sovereignty." And on Ashwood's private board channel, one director simply wrote, "She doesn't need to talk. We all heard her." Back on the flight, a woman sitting in front of Grace turned slightly in her seat. "I hope you don't mind," she said nervously. "I saw the photo, the one you just sent. It's beautiful." Grace gave a small smile. "Thank you. Is it okay if I save it?" Grace nodded. "It's not mine anymore." That line, too, would echo. "It's not mine anymore." Just like the story. It had started with a seat, then a silence, then a stand. Now it belonged to everyone who had ever been moved, silenced, dismissed, or doubted. At the International Summit, the audience had prepared to welcome her. Her name was printed on banners, her photo framed beside global leaders. When the screen lit up with only an image, clouds and sky, there was a pause. And then, unexpectedly, applause. Not thunderous, but thoughtful, lasting. It was a standing ovation for someone who chose not to take the stage, and in doing so, elevated the entire message. Claire Hill, watching from the back row, smiled for the first time in days. Next to her, an editor from The Economist murmured, "Your daughter just redefined what leadership looks like." Claire replied quietly, "She didn't redefine it. She reminded us." Somewhere over the Atlantic, Grace sat in quiet again, her journal on her lap. Inside, a single note was taped beside the photo she took. "Power doesn't shout, it decides." And with that, the rising star kept climbing. The first line of the new policy memo was printed in bold across every screen inside Ashwood Group's global headquarters. Effective immediately, all customer-facing personnel, regardless of rank or tenure, will complete the Grace Protocol training within 90 days. The name wasn't chosen lightly. It had passed through the legal department, PR, ethics, and the CEO's own office before it went live. But everyone agreed. The moment needed to be immortalized, not sanitized. And so it was. Grace Protocol, respect reinforcement, and accountability framework. The purpose? Simple on paper, seismic in culture. No more vague promises, no more afterthought training. Every crew member, call center agent, gate attendant, executive assistant, and vendor rep, everyone would be trained, tested, and certified on a newly designed code of conduct built from the very mistakes that had made Grace famous. The first slide of the training course was as striking as it was quiet. It didn't show Grace's name, not her photo, just a line of text in her voice. "Let others talk, you act." The quote had been plucked from her private correspondence by permission and approved by the Hill family. Underneath it, the module loaded with case study, Flight 719. Other airlines watched with interest. Then unease. Then urgency. By the end of the month, no fewer than 6 competitors announced their own versions of empathy protocol programs, citing Ashwood's initiative as inspiration. Some accused them of following a trend, but the public didn't care. For once, the trend was the right direction. On social media, the hashtag Grace Protocol trended not because it was sensational, but because it offered people something rare. The feeling that someone had listened. A video of a gate agent in Chicago patiently helping a stressed mother with 3 kids went viral under the caption, "Training changed us. We see you now." A flight attendant posted her certificate with the line, "We got this wrong once. We won't again." Back in D.C., inside a quiet townhouse lined with soft light and stronger women, Grace was reading letters. They came daily now, some formal, some scribbled, some typed in shaky fonts. All of them were some version of the same thing. Thank you for not yelling. Thank you for waiting. Thank you for showing us what we couldn't see until it was too late. One letter, however, was hand-delivered. The envelope bore no stamp, no name, just the Ashwood internal courier code. Internal, legal review approved. Inside was a short note, neat, nervous. "Grace, I know I have no right to ask, but I'm requesting to meet face to face, not for my sake, for yours. I don't want to be the story you carry. I want to ask, human to human, for your forgiveness, K. Scott." Grace read it once, then set it aside. She didn't hesitate. She didn't even discuss it with her father or mother. She simply opened her laptop, tapped into the internal reply system, and typed, "I heard enough that day." Then she pressed send. Karen Scott received the message 2 hours later. She was sitting in a small office space leased near Annapolis, where she'd been assigned to temporary retraining and psychological review before any possible re-entry into aviation. When she read the words, she didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just nodded, folded the laptop shut, and sat back in her chair. "I guess that's it," she whispered. The counselor in the room with her asked, "Was that the closure you hoped for?" Karen shook her head. "It's the one I deserved." Meanwhile, in Geneva, a representative from the United Nations Civil Aviation Council held a press conference. Behind him, 2 banners stood tall, one of them bearing the Ashwood logo, the other a simple line of text. Grace Protocol, adopted internationally, Phase 1. The rep cleared his throat. "While we regret that it took a public failure to inspire global change, we acknowledge the rare moment when a system corrects itself not by force, but by example. Today, we begin the process of embedding respect, not as a courtesy, but as a code." He paused, inspired by one young woman who proved that calm is not weakness and silence is not absence. Back at the townhouse, Grace closed her laptop and walked to the kitchen. Her mother was preparing tea. Her father was reading beside the window. No press, no statements, just home. She sat down and pulled a blank page from her journal. At the top she wrote, "What comes after silence?" She hadn't answered that yet, but she would. Later that evening, Maddie, the former flight attendant, sent her a short message through Ashwood's mentorship platform. "I'm joining the training team. I just wanted you to know that I'll make sure they get it right this time, for real." Grace replied with one word, "Thank you." Because sometimes the biggest change isn't in punishing the old, it's in preparing the new. Months passed. The headlines faded, as they always do. New scandals, fresh stories, louder controversies took their place. But Grace Hill remained, not in the news, not in the spotlight, but in the hearts of thousands. Her story was no longer a viral moment. It was a shift, a turning point. And for those who had once sat in silence, passed over, or pushed aside, she had become a lighthouse. Not because she spoke loudly, but because she never did. Her mailbox, both physical and digital, became a shrine of gratitude. Letters from pilots, from school teachers, from janitors, from teenagers, and most of all, from parents. One envelope arrived on recycled paper, crayon drawings on the back. Inside was a folded note, written in uneven, careful handwriting. "Dear Miss Grace, my daughter uses a wheelchair. People used to ignore her on planes, pretend she wasn't there. Flight attendants would serve snacks over her head like she didn't exist. But last week, we flew again." A man in uniform crouched to her level and said, "Welcome aboard, young lady." Then he waited. He didn't rush. He listened. He even asked what movie she wanted to watch first. When we landed, someone bowed slightly and said, "Thank you for flying with us." No one had ever bowed to her. They didn't know your name, but I did. You changed her sky. With gratitude. A mother who noticed. Grace read the letter in her bedroom, the sunset leaking soft orange across the walls. She didn't cry. She didn't even smile. She just picked up her pen, turned to her journal, and wrote one sentence. Justice isn't noise. It's the absence of surrender. She underlined it once, then closed the book. Ashwood's ethics board would later publish a white paper on the incident, referencing Flight 799 as a cornerstone event in shifting global passenger policy. But Grace never read it. She didn't need a footnote. She had the clouds. On a mild spring morning, Grace boarded another flight. No fanfare. She wore a simple sweater, carried her own bag, and sat in her seat like anyone else. She didn't flash credentials, didn't mention her name. The boarding pass read, Grace Hill, Seat 2A. No one questioned it. No one challenged it. Because the world had changed, and the system that once saw her as a mistake now recognized her as a measure. As the engines roared and the cabin tilted upward, Grace leaned into the window. Outside, the sky stretched in infinite blue. Not loud, not proud, just vast, still, listening. In that moment, she didn't think about the protocols or the media stories or the thousands of thank you notes. She thought about silence. Not the kind that hides, the kind that builds, the kind that waits until the noise passes and then moves everything without saying a word. Behind her, a young boy asked his father, "Why's everyone quiet when she walks by?" The father whispered, "Because she once did something loud, without making a sound." And up in the clouds, Grace closed her eyes. Not because she was tired, but because some things, like peace, are easier to feel when the world stops asking you to prove anything. She never claimed to be a hero. She never wrote a memoir. She never took the stage. But the system knew her name. The sky remembered. And every seat she took from then on came with a silence that spoke louder than words ever could.